Welcome, Yasaman Sheri here to Products of Design.
Thank you so much, Alan. What a generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm coming from Los Angeles, so it's really exciting to be experiencing the cold. Today, I'm going to talk about synthetic ecologies is the title of my talk, but really the underlying topic is about design. I come from a design background. Hi, SVA. I'm Yasaman Sheri, and that's my handle. I enjoy using it, and you can message me anytime there. I'm a designer, writer, and researcher, and I love that Alan mentioned that I should say writer first, because I've been writing a lot recently. I like to talk about my practice, and less so I like to talk about what I am as a noun, and more about what I like to do. And I keep coming back to what grounds me, which is I ask questions, I design and build platforms, I seek creative inquiry and imagination, I mentor women and BIPOC, and I lead through inspiration. I have a curiosity-driven practice, and I work with tools that explore life sciences and ecology. So for me, these keep recurring back, which makes my practice grounded in this way. And one of the reasons I do that is because I intentionally situate myself at boundaries of different disciplinary practices. This is my favorite choreographer, William Forsythe, and a project called Choreographed Objects, and it deeply inspired a lot of my work and continues to inspire my work. But ultimately, I've recently, and I'm forever curious around gaming, culinary arts, choreography, sciences. These things seem like not part of design, but I follow my practice in this way that I follow my interest in these different disciplinary practices. Tonight, I have a few modules that I'd like to go over, which are departures and moments where my practice has built a new form. And so I'll start with the first one. As Alan mentioned, this one is design as industrial. I studied industrial design, and at that time, design was really about mass production. Yet in design history, we always learn about how it came from craft. In fact, ornamentation was a huge part of design. This is actually still my favorite chair, Tonet, bentwood, and there's many different numbers for the different modalities that they have built. I believe it was the first flat pack chair, and I do have it in my home too. And I find it interesting that we've kind of departed from this kind of design and moved very much into hyper-industrialization. And recently I've had a new obsession back to ornamentation, but even within industrial design. I find it really beautiful. And once I mentioned to someone that I find this beautiful, and they were a designer, and they said, "So you like things that are frilly?" I'd like to unpack that in an essay. But as I began to build work in design, and none of my design work looks like this, most of the industrial design work that I did was very much around playful interactions outdoors and in public spaces, and then later on in building computers, housing for computers, that was very industrial design. I began to notice the interfaces that I work with, specifically the materials that I get to work with. So the notion of interface kept coming into my mind. And I thought paper was a really interesting one. Or sometimes I think about cars or PlayStation and gaming. And then recently I've been thinking about money and how money has interesting interfaces. But the reason I began thinking about it is because when I was teaching at CIID, Copenhagen Institute for Interaction Design, I began to kind of learn more and more about Bill Moggridge. Even though I knew about Bill Moggridge, who is kind of, he coined the term interaction design, but he has this laptop, which is the grid compass, and he talks about the grid compass being the first time he built an interface, and he was sucked into the computer and began to kind of work with the interactions. So from there, my work wasn't just becoming about interfaces or housing for interactions and technological objects, but it became about inputs and how I interact with the actual computers. So I began to read more about it. What is an input? What was one of the first inputs? And turns out that Douglas Engelbart wrote a very long paper, it's very long, called Augmenting the Human Intellect, a Conceptual Framework. And it really talks about one of the first computing inputs, the mouse. So this is the first prototype of a mouse. And what I found really interesting was this notion of augmentation of the human intellect, specifically this notion of like the mind and intellectual thinking. And then from there, I was just kind of like deep in Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad, who, Sketchpad so much has connection with Illustrator that we use every day to day, Figma, and all these tools that we use all the time. But essentially looking at the interface as a way of sketching or building, interacting with. You might all already know this because you're from industrial design background. But to incorporate my curiosity into my practice, that curiosity about interfaces and augmenting the human intellect, I departed and a new practice was formed, which we moved on to interfaces, module 2. I was invited after I gave a talk at IDSA, Industrial Design Society of America conference, which I applied to, and I remember I took a very expensive plane, and I went, and they didn't pay for my plane either, and I gave a talk, and my talk was actually about ecology, which is very interesting, but someone, it's called headhunting, but they asked me to join Microsoft, and they didn't tell me what it's about, but I kind of I find it interesting that I was reading about augmenting human intellect, and then here I was working for a company that was building an augmented reality headset, one of the first ones that was mass consumer shipped as a mass consumer product. So I got to work with a really amazing team of really thoughtful people. Actually, a bunch of them are from New York, and we designed a new operating system and interaction design for HoloLens 1 and then later for HoloLens 2. And then from there, just all sorts of other projects unraveled, like working on Magic Leap 2, which is not the first one. The first one, everyone talks about the first one. The 2 is better because I work on it. No, I'm kidding. And some other secret projects that I can't talk about, but essentially around self-driving cars and thinking about sensing outside of working with sensors not on the headset, but on the car itself, so different scales. I work with IKEA's Space 10, which recently closed, but essentially they're the experimental design research lab, and we worked on augmented intelligence. And then most recently with Meta neural interfaces, which is looking at novel inputs. And so that kind of work really made me think about what is an interface, because now we're extending our bodies to know more and interact more and even feel differently from a nervous system perspective even. And so that kind of took me a whole direction where people started asking me to teach. And I remember once I gave actually the way that I started teaching at CIID was I gave a lecture, and my lecture was about sensing. And so I tried to bring this concept of machine sensing that I had been learning from augmented reality into other forms of sensing. And they actually asked me to teach a curriculum on that. So that's how I kind of dive deeper into thinking about other forms of sensing, which I'll talk about in a second. But from these interfaces and working on all these different operating systems in augmented reality headsets and VR headsets, what did I learn? Well, I like to document what I learn, especially if I'm going to have a departure in career. I learned that sensing, whether it's machine sensing or human sensing, is deeply political. I learned that interface is a liminal space where two meet, or three, or four. but it doesn't have to be between human and a computer. I learned that taxonomy and words matter. I also learned that there's a hierarchy of sensing, that in fact we're so focused on the eye and the ocular, you can even think of oculus, at the very top, and some of the other senses at the very bottom, such as smell, and many others. I also learned that interaction design, this profession that I had kind of like synced into and worked in, needs critical thinking. And there's not a lot of writers writing about the critical elements of interaction design. People write about technology, but interaction designers don't write about it as much critically. I also decided to, I also learned that intelligence, machine intelligence, using all the sensing, is something we shape it to be. It's not just intelligent on its own. And finally, lists shape interactions. And by that, I mean when we have data sets, when we have essentially mostly data sets, shape the way that we perceive and the way that we interact with computing systems. So those learnings really made me want to do something about it, because I couldn't just sit there and keep making the same thing. So when I was asked to teach at CID, I decided to create my curriculum around sensing. So I created the Sensing School. And here my students, which I really love the ethos at CID, which is build, test, repeat, and recently is build, test, repeat, reflect, which I love. And so we were very much not just about physical computing, but also building rapid prototypes that felt just like as you do in industrial design, but around interfaces and interactions. In this way, around sensing, not just the eye, but also the hand, haptics, smell, and even sound, and even taste. We went far. Coming back to William Forsythe, choreographed objects, the choreographer I mentioned, this show was on view at ICA in Boston. And I really love, as an industrial designer, to think about how objects make us move. And so this reminded me of the kind of work that I was doing in the Sensing School, where students get to practice different forms of moving their own bodies in relation to objects. This is a very heavy door, and he intentionally situated it in an exhibition where every person had to really pull themselves to open the door, and I thought that was so beautiful. Industrial designers know about this, but it's exciting to see choreographers thinking about this in a very different way. So I deep dived into Choreographer's Handbook, which is a really interesting essay and writing by Jonathan Burrows, and talking about collaboration and what a choreography is, micro gestures and choreography. And it really got me thinking about cinematic gestures. What are gestures even? In fact, when I was working at operating systems in augmented reality, so much of what I did were gestures, gestural interface. But the gestural interface is used for selection, for moving. But what about these gestures? These gestures that tell us so much about culture. So we did gestural studies, and that was really fun. As you can see, lists are a big part of my practice. What could gestures be? Micro gestures, loud gestures, silent gestures, emotional gestures, gestures of pain, full body gestures, part body gestures, gestures done with tools, sonic gestures, subtle gestures, and the list goes on. And with my students, we began to kind of look at what these gestures could feel like, and what are the little, almost like choreographed practice and exercises where we could begin to think about design in a very different way, whether with objects, with environments, with each other. And so I invited many different guests, and one of the courses I invited Madeline Schwartzman, who also teaches here in New York City. She has a very, very lovely practice where she has students work with paper. These are my students, and when Madeline visited, they kind of built these lo-fi tools where they would like play, just for play, to learn more about gestures and what they could mean and expand their imagination around the types of interactions and products and relational work that we could make together. I really love this, and we all had so much fun. And so as we did this, one question kept coming up. What about living things? And this is such a beautiful gesture to me. It's so poetic, it's so soft. And so came the other departure, life forms, and module 3. Sorry for the red screen on your eyes. So to incorporate my curiosity in my practice, again, a new practice emerged. Here with the students, we would begin to now not just look at interfaces that are around visual, AR, VR, inputs, Now we were looking at smell, which was so interesting that the world of smell is so barred. It's so siloed. There's like perfumers, and there's like 2 or 3 star artists, and then there is like the industry where they like mass manufacture the smells that you associate with all sorts of things subconsciously. So we were like, what if we bring smell into our design practice? And we would go around, we would do smell walks, which is an established practice, but we would write it down and begin to incorporate it into interfaces and work around with objects, and it was really just playful. And the students would write down their ideas of what they learned, and the things that would come up were so bizarre. They were definitely not like what you experience in a perfume shop, like rosy or woody. It would be like toxic or borderline disgusting, not natural, lingering. And so I think just like the gestural studies, in some ways these became studies of olfaction. And from there, we would go on a lot of different visits, which could be seen as studio visits, but you know, when you think about biology and molecules and these spaces where scientists get to work and play, students have very strong perspectives, especially when we talk about technology in relation to that. So instead of keeping our perspectives and point of view, we put them on hold and we went to very different opposing spaces, like a biotech lab and Noma fermentation lab in a famous restaurant, or zero waste kitchen. And we did environmental samples run by different scientists. And so after like talking with different people, our perspectives began to muddy, and they're no longer binary, they're complicated. And from there, when you think about interfaces again, what could it look like? How could it work with the knowledge that we have now? So from here, I felt that my practice was moving from machine sensing into biological sensing. And if you remember the interfaces I showed at the beginning, now I had to think about a new kind of interface, which was bigger than me, way bigger than me, a scale that I couldn't even perceive. Another scale that I also cannot perceive is microbial scale. I had the opportunity here to, by seeking that curiosity, to explore biotechnology. And here I was a resident at Ginkgo Bioworks, which is a biotech company. And I got really excited about biosensors because I was interested in sensing. So what is a biological sensor? Well, it turns out there's many, there's kind of chemical sensors that we use all the time that we know very well about. We have COVID tests, we have pH tests, we have urine tests, we have all sorts of tests that we embed chemical and molecular and biological kind of sensors into. And so if you remember a paper as interface, I was very inspired by that. So I wanted to learn how can we think about different forms of biosensors that aren't necessarily made for industry practice, like pH testing or hormone tests, but could it be used as a design object or practice? So this is what it is a protein, but it's essentially a biological sensor. And it does exist in a human slash animal body slash other living bodies. And I found the protein library, which was like a list of biological sensors. And here you can see there's so many different kinds. There's smell sensors, there's nicotine sensors. They're essentially sensing molecules. So any kind of molecule there's almost always a biological sensor for it. But that was cool. What does it mean if we were to embed it into something? Ultimately, I want to embed it into paper or something that I can use, kind of like urine test or COVID test, but like maybe not like that, maybe for like a design object. But the first thing we did, which is cool things you can do in a biotech company, is you can embed it in an actual living organism. So this is yeast on one half, and the other half is E. coli. These are two microorganisms. And one of them, we embedded a biosensor, and the other one, we made it produce the molecule. So the molecule is producing the smell, which proprietary. I can't talk about which smell we've embedded in because it is a biotech company. And on the other side, the biosensor of that particular smell existed. And so just like input-outputs of a computer, we asked it to, once you smell it, make yourself blue. So it would become blue. So that's the output that it created. And it's so abstract, and it's so hard to see. I just wanted to see it. But it's so interesting that you can think about this as a new form of interface that is biological. But again, this felt very small size, so I wanted to come back to the scale that we are at. And this particular scale meant a lot to me. So I started with paper, and I wanted to make it like test strips. But then I asked myself, could it be jewelry? Could it be one-time use objects that I could wear, kind of like my wearables practice? What if I go to a bar and I get a drink and I leave it down and then I come back to it? I could test it for all sorts of things, like if someone put something in it. That's a bad example, but you could test all sorts of things. You could test in your daily practice, if you want to know if a molecule exists, you could test it for food and fermentation, if something has gone bad. You could, and so I thought this was so exciting and interesting that I went from being hyper digital to coming back to this physical practice. But then I just had so much to say about it, because once you follow this thread, you're just like filled with a lot of ideas, and you're like, wait, I have to process this. And honestly, I think for me, the best way to process, despite making work, has also been writing. And I really recommend everyone to write. If you're a designer, just write, just practice writing. Architects have this practice, artists have this practice. It's a deep practice that can sit next to your other practices. So Mold asked me to write an essay around sensing, and I wanted to think about an anti-manifesto or some form of a manifesto, and I recommend folks to read it. I would like to continue with this and update it, but it still stands true. And here's the QR code for it if you're interested. You can also just look it up. And what I love about it, love about writing, is I was finally able to kind of at least put in point form some of my thoughts around how it's political, why is sensing political, or why is it, where did the history of all this stuff come from? And there's more histories that I haven't even unraveled. So as I began to work in this space, as you can see, a lot of thoughts came into my mind, but it really made me think about the concept of scale. It also made me think about scale from a different perspective. It's funny, just a few nights ago, I went to a talk at Memo R&D, and they were talking about this. So I just find it interesting. I have the same thing in my talk, but essentially it's that scale doesn't always have to be around climate biological, which is something I interact with a lot, like microbial scale and like astronomical scale. And astrological, cosmic scale. But I find it interesting that the data scale is also very, very large, and it's beyond what I can even comprehend. So the scale part comes up. And I continue this practice of writing and thinking and situating myself in spaces that I don't fully understand. So, and honestly, that make me a little bit uncomfortable. So I had the opportunity to go to Biosphere 2, which is a very bizarre space that was an experiment around ecological landscapes, which are very human-centered way of thinking about ecology. And there again, coming back to the paper that I just talked about, I wanted to explore materials and interfaces that are not digital and physical, coming back to that industrial design practice, but in this new form. So I got really excited about glass as an interface, specifically around the idea of containment and containing biological materials. So there I had an exhibition where I worked around microbial life that's contained within glass, and how glass can become this sterile separation of microbial life. It was beautiful because Biosphere 2 is glass, and is for 2-3 years it held humans and other living things inside in a closed system without opening the air. And then at some point they had to open the air. But being inside it inspired me to think about it, but from a microbial invisible perspective. So what did I learn here around biology? Well, I learned that biology's scale is not just physical, but it's also temporal. Biology takes time. It's slower than us, or it can be faster than us. I also learned that there's a lot of silos and hierarchies that keep many out, including myself. And that a lot of this doesn't have indigenous knowledge or practices platformed or included in it. Once again, making lists aided me in learning. For example, that protein list that I got to learn about. And I also learned that knowing can be diverse in both gaze, not just knowing from kind of like your viewpoint, but also in format. Knowing doesn't have to be in white papers and published. Knowing can be embodied. And I also learned that you should document your work, because sometimes I didn't document my work. And where is it? But what I really came back to after all this was that I need to go back to systems and the idea of systems thinking. So once again, to incorporate this curiosity into my practice, a new practice formed. I won't get into this one as much, but I will mention that I started with this notion of operating systems and building them and designing them, working with engineers to ship them. Many operating systems that I've built are in products right now that you can use, which we mentioned the Apple headset is exciting. However, what is an operating system? I'm currently actually writing about that, but it's a set of essentially rules and set of operations that you get to perform within a system so that it doesn't collapse. So it runs in a way that is somehow contained and works nicely with each other. Within that work, within that systems thinking, I began to think a lot around ecology, and as I had worked with Biosphere 2. Some of the work I began to do was, for example, this one is a residency. I worked with microbial life in extreme environments. So here's Antarctica. And Antarctica is a desert, a polar desert, and the driest continent of Earth. And I find this very interesting because a lot of people told me when I lived in Seattle, oh, you love Seattle. It's so, the nature is really nice. And now I live near a desert, and I think the nature is also very nice, but people don't talk about that. And I find this notion of a desert empty of life very curious. So really how we our viewpoint and our gaze towards nature and our humanistic projection of what is and what isn't felt kind of odd to me. It didn't match some of the ways that I was thinking or had been taught to think. So I built a project around it where I wanted to think about how stories and narratives can tell a story about how we think about life forms. And I got really inspired by typewriters and glyphs. So I got really excited about digital glyphs, but also physical glyphs. And this one that was called a horticultural dingbat, which is which is a glyph that you can use in your keyboard and in your typefaces that is actually inspired by nature. But I was like, what if we talk about those non-living or desert-like, absent of life organisms. They seem invisible, but why don't we bring it into our daily interactions with our phones? So then I thought it was kind of cheeky that I wanted to build a typeface that's a microbial typeface that's all glyphs. And again, coming back to lists, I didn't know where to start. So I began to look at different microorganisms that lived in type of extreme environments like salt and deep crust and acid and high heat and cold. And so I built all these different ones with crazy scientific names that are Latin, and began to not just think about what they look like, but what they act like as well. So here's one, it looks like this. Here's my manifestation of it. Here's another one. Here's my manifestation of it. But then I was like, what if it just doesn't look like that? It acts like that. So I got excited about ligatures, which is essentially when two letters connect with each other. So I was like, what if we can behaviorally also change in our digital interfaces when you have multiple keys selected? And could the microbe grow? Could it be related to that microbe? And so on. So maybe if you click once, it might be 4 pieces, but if you click many, it's not just going to repeat the same one, but it's actually going to grow. This is a fun project. It was just an exercise, but it did make me think a lot about systems, particularly because everyone can access that by downloading a typeface in their phones. And I worked with a scientist who was a plant pathologist, and he and I had this idea that we could also put each microbe, we could have its DNA sequenced and put the sequencing of A, T, C, G in every typeface has like subnotes that we could put it inside as a background. But ultimately what I really wanted was to change the human gaze and for people to kind of, you know how important emojis are, to kind of change the culture around how we think about systems of microbes and our systems of gazing around nature. I just have a few more slides, by the way. As the work continued and the curiosity brought me from a variety of disciplines to grow on my own practice, I really did begin to realize, though, that for me, the collective imagination is really the most important operating system and the rules of structuring systems. So the last point is common creation. Now, common creation, collective human interaction is very important to me. But I did want to put this particular one because I saw my friend Elliot Montgomery recently, and he used to teach here. And I felt like a little shout out could be fun. And Chris Wopkin, we did a collective project together, which was a workshop at Ginkgo Bioworks, the biotech company. And we kind of began to think about, what are your imaginations as scientists? What do you want to make beyond cancer? And so it was really fun. We kind of looked at these things that I call sense objects, and it's essentially looking at novel or playful apparatus that could think about sensing from a very different biological perspective. And we built so many different ones, this is very much, I think, extrapolation factory style. But I had a lot of fun times thinking about sensing and the content of the work that we did. So coming back to the common practice, and not just collaborating with friends, but also, I was asked in 2020, right before the pandemic actually, even though this launched in October, they asked me in 2019, they were like, hey, Serpentine Galleries, we're building an R&D platform. Would you like to run a lab on your practice? And I got really excited because you know how I love to be at the intersection of different disciplinary practices, and I was like, ooh, the art world. So I built the Synthetic Ecologies lab with the support of R&D platform at Serpentine. And the focus of this lab, which is still ongoing, is to look into creative inquiry on life sciences and ecology. One of the goals that we have is to have a powerful platform for artists, designers, scientists through tools, data sets, lists, empowering new practice, contributing to biological technologies, and also narratives. But coming back to the lists, if you go and learn about ecology, let's say you're very interested in ecology, you'll go on the internet, you'll look something up. you'll get a list that is very hyper-focused of a particular format, like a protein data bank, or, I don't know, a book about a particular thing. But one thing that I got really excited about, and sitting at these different disciplinary practices, was that you can have a graphic novel around the same time as an essay, as a scientist's white paper, and they could all be telling a story of that particular time, like 1943. And I find that so interesting. Even fashion, you can look at so many different disciplines that are seemingly disparate, but if you kind of zoom into that time, they all tell a story of that time. So I got excited about Ted Nelson's hypertext, which is the precursor to, some people say, the internet, that everything is intertwined. And it also turns out that is Arena, which is a platform run by my good friend Charles Broskowski, is also their motto that everything's interconnected. And I highly recommend you guys to check out Arena if you haven't. And so I wanted to explore how different things could be interconnected. I love seeing Prada doing an exhibition on the brain. Why? Very interesting. But so coming back to lists again, the first project that we wanted to do as Synthetic Ecologies Lab is to build a database and a list, an archive, a directory, a resource for people who are engaging with the space, who don't know much about it, but to be able to look at content that is free, accessible, and open source, essentially. And so we built the Synthetic Ecologies Compendium. And the season 1 launched a year ago. And we wanted to make it seasonal so that we can access different topics. And the first one, the inaugural one, is called Microbial Lores. And instead of doing it myself, coming back to the common creation and the commons, I wanted to build a team of thoughtful interdisciplinary folks to build this. You can check it out online, but I brought in a writer, a researcher, a practitioner of materials, a flavor historian, a chef, a fermentation scientist from Crick Institute, co-founder of Arena, and my lovely producer, Alexander Boyce. So this was our team. And together we decided to kind of build over a period of 6 months different content, essentially, that lives in the compendium and is available for you to use as well, around microbial lore, meaning microbial storytelling. So here you can have a tweet from Bjork, you can have a white paper, you can have religious deities that reflect microbial thinking. So these things that potentially don't feel like they're belonging can belong. And also, we wanted it to expand even more, further beyond what we wanted this list to be, but also other people to make their own lists and their own curation. So here, for example, Mindy Sue, who's not only a friend, she also designed the website, made slime molds in Silicon Valley as like a collection. Or Somnath Bhatt, who was our artist, who did a very beautiful illustration, made machines in the garden. And this, you can actually select it, and it downloads a PDF like a book format for you. And again, coming back to this common practice and common creation, I now care a lot about collective creation. The last thing I'll share is that a year ago, we launched a book. It's supported by Wang and Sordenstrom, my friends Annie and Tim. They had this idea that we should make a book with 5 essays that are collective coming together. So it's an essay anthology with the idea of what is a home. Home as host, host as home. And so my essay in it is called Microbial Home and Our Networks of Metabolisms. And so collectively, we've built this book together. It's very untraditional, especially because there were exhibitions a part of it and so on. And so these 5 things that I talked about tonight are how I've shifted my practice, and I'm very excited to continue doing that, both in writing, in my own practice, and in just following my curiosity and in my education transmission. So to shift our perspective and continue, we have to think about new ways of seeing. And I just want to say thank you. much.